I came back because I am who I am because of the community I grew up in. I think you can never leave a place that helped raise you when they raised you in a good way.
You know, my generation, the kids that grew up here, are coming back and saying, hey, we still love this community. And we're tired of the violence and the negative stereotypes. How can we make that change?
The media is focused mostly on, the 5 o'clock news, like, oh, shooting this, shooting that.
That's not all for the malfunction junction. If you're going to Boyle Heights, you better pack a snack. You've got 2 cigarettes on the East LA Interchange.
In the next hour, we're going to take you to a neighborhood where stray bullets claim innocent lives, where witnesses are afraid to talk to police, and where just standing on the wrong sidewalk can get you killed.
Look at what's happening now to Boyle Heights. The story is not over.
To live in Boyle Heights was an experience of life. It was life because you had the crosswalk of so many different groups living together, and it brought the good, the bad, and everything else.
My parents were from Texas and Oklahoma, and they were kind of tough, they were redneck types, where they are still today, I hate to say, but my dad and mother told me, you blend in with everybody. Everybody here is equal as you are, and the same with them. They're all equal.
When you start to think about why people can't get along, or, the stereotypes that don't get broken down, or racism, I think it's basically because people don't know how to be comfortable with one another. But in Boyle Heights, we were comfortable.
East of downtown Los Angeles lies Boyle Heights, once called the laboratory of democracy. This working-class neighborhood has steadfastly fought to maintain its community, surviving discriminatory federal legislation, devastating freeway development, and environmental racism. Today, Boyle Heights faces impending gentrification that could forever change the face of this quintessential American neighborhood.
The start of the 20th century had a tremendous amount of global crises, be they wars, depressions, that led to people really moving in an unprecedented way all over the world. Some of that came to the United States, and some of that came directly to Los Angeles. And Boyle Heights was one place in which generally they were all welcome. So that meant that it was unique in Los Angeles because everyone could live there, and at some point everyone did live there.
There was an Irish family, and then my aunt, and then mine, then a Jewish family.
My neighbors were like the Muramotos, the Fukuchis, the Gabrielinis, the Robocals, the Volkovs.
An Italian family, Japanese, a Mexican family.
I spoke Spanish and Yiddish growing up. And when I went into kindergarten, they had to teach me remedial English.
An Indian and a Caucasian family. That was just one street.
Neighborhoods such as Boyle Heights are especially important because they're uniquely American. It's not about being of one group or another and keeping that so-called clannish identity. These neighborhoods have never been about that.
There has to be a place where people are more tolerant. They're going to put up with people who have different religions, speak different languages, are not white.
I know that this had a positive effect on me, especially once you became an adult and you had to leave your precious Boyle Heights and go out into the rest of the world. I never had any difficulties relating to other people because there was never a time when I ever met anyone that didn't look like one of my classmates or one of my neighbors.
Known as the Ellis Island of the West Coast, Boyle Heights was one of the most sustainably diverse communities in the United States in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. But this multicultural refuge sprang from ethnically segregating federal legislation.
Racially restrictive covenants was a nationwide phenomenon, but Los Angeles really leads in this area. What they are is, as Los Angeles is growing and new properties are formed, the initial deed of sale has in it restrictions against who could own the property. It always included African Americans, it usually included Mexican Americans, Asian Americans, sometimes included European groups like Jews, Italians.
Restrictive legislation was immigration based on fears of people who would not assimilate or who were thought not to be able to assimilate.
Things didn't really melt in Boyle Heights. Cultures didn't melt in Boyle Heights. One of the things about the melting pot myth is that somehow that there was an intense community pressure to just become one thing. In Boyle Heights, if you looked around, you really couldn't tell what exactly you were becoming. At certain periods, maybe Jews were wearing zoot suits. In other periods, maybe you learned how to eat sushi. In other periods, you were learning about Jewish culture if you weren't Jewish. Is that a melting pot? I don't really think so.
I remember walking to school and I smelled something that smelled so good. And I kind of walked around to the back door of this house and I looked through the screen door and there was a woman making tortillas. And I had never, I'd never seen or had anything like that. It just smelled so good. So I just stood there and looked kind of pathetic. And she gave me a tortilla and I was in heaven.
These are communities that, with limited resources, are constantly improvising. That's what makes us Americans. It's that constant improvisation based on certain kinds of ideals that are very hard to realize. It's very hard to realize, we the people, what does it mean to be equal?
Well, it's definitely not Orange County, it's definitely not Beverly Hills, it's not fancy, it's not elegant. But I think there's a real sense of community because people tend to help each other. There's a really generous feeling that I see in the community. I see people who, are willing to reach in their pockets to help somebody less fortunate, which I don't see in a lot of other areas. And so I think because of that, there's a real bonding in Boyle Heights.
Oh, yeah, because that's home. Well, just to give you an idea, my parents were deported to Japan after the war. Years later, I got them back, and LA had grown. I picked them up at the terminal, and as I was driving through LA, they just were, amazed at the change. As soon as we entered Boyle Heights, we're home. Hadn't changed a bit. I'm Cedric Shimo, and before the war, I used to live here.
This uniquely integrated community would be torn apart at the start of World War II, when Japanese-American residents were rounded up and sent away to internment camps.
I lived in Boyle Heights all my life, but after graduating UCLA, I was supposed to go to Japan because I wanted to be what you call a bridge between Japan and the United States. But young men of military age could not leave the country. So I went to Cal Berkeley for graduate work, and I figured I'll mark time there till everything blows over, and I'll go to Japan. But instead, Pearl Harbor came. So That was December 7th, and on December 8th, I got my draft notice from LA. So I went to the train depot and tried to get on the train to come back to LA, but they won't let me on. Right from the beginning, I was the enemy, and they thought I would sabotage the train. So I had to hitchhike all the way back to the draft board and join the U.S. Army.
You had in Boyle Heights sort of a front row seat to Japanese American internment for all the other groups, not just for Japanese Americans. This led to a lot of tensions in the community. You had many of the Japanese American leaders of the community jailed and put into camps. You then had the widespread evacuation and incarceration of all Japanese American families. So, for example, at Roosevelt High School, 1/3 of the student body of the class of 1942 was Japanese American. So you have to imagine students of all backgrounds who saw 1/3 of their classmates taken away, incarcerated because they were Japanese Americans.
I was in Belvedere Junior High School then, and one day just our friends were gone.
To take a group of people and just cart them off, and because your fears, and they're American citizens? No, that is just not right.
The Americanism of the great majority of America's Japanese finds its highest expression in the thousands who were in the United States Army.
So I was in the Army, and then while I was in the Army, my mother wrote to me and said, hey, Dad got picked up by the FBI because he ran a martial arts studio. And then a little later, my mother wrote me that now she's been kicked out.
2/3 of the evacuees are American citizens by right of birth. The rest are their Japanese-born parents and grandparents.
We get a furlough. So I applied for Manzanar to say goodbye to my Boyle Heights friends and my mother. But I was turned down because at that time, no Japanese, even soldiers, were allowed on the West Coast. So here we were ready to go to the Pacific Front and couldn't go to California.
As in cities all along the West Coast, Japanese Americans in Boyle Heights had to pack up their homes and businesses overnight, taking only what they could carry with them. Countless valuables and family heirlooms had to be left behind. Out of desperation, many people buried precious items in their gardens, hoping to reclaim them upon their return.
Most families probably lost everything. Here, this was a patio. There was a cement wall and a built-in barbecue, and the garden kept going up there, and the Japanese garden was way down there.
Changed a little bit.
Changed a lot. My folks buried a lot of things in the backyard, thinking that when they get back, they'll dig it up again.
Ahí está, no está uno puesto así en el arriba ahí. Eso estaba, yo me lo encontré y que deja traer para mí.
You said you're gonna bring something he's found?
This is come from Japan, I don't know exactly. You got some houses?
No, it must have been one of my folks' things. It's amazing. I'm glad I came here just for this. Yeah, I'll be darned. one relic got left. Muchas gracias.
You kind of wanted to live in a place where you would be accepted. And it was when I was an early teenager. Now, I can recall, even as a young boy, certain parts of Hollywood would say Gentiles only.
We would get together, we would meet, we would put out a little newspaper, and don't ask me about it, but I can't even remember anything about the newspaper except that we put out a little newspaper, and we would get together, and under the street lights, we would dance the hora.
In the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, Boyle Heights was home to the largest Jewish community on the West Coast. All of that would change with the end of World War II.
White flight is a term that came of age in the post-war years. White flight, in its sort of textbook form, refers to the idea that a neighborhood reaches some kind of tipping point wherein the population becomes diverse to an extent that whites become uncomfortable and then leave.
This is a time of great immigration, right? Millions of people come to the LA area, and developers and the state simply cannot build housing fast enough to house all these people coming in. So there's a big shift in the racial formation here in Los Angeles. And at the same time, we have a decrease in the levels of residential segregation for those people who are considered not quite white, which would be the people who are Russian, Polish, Jewish, Armenian, Greek. With that, at the same time, their own racial and ethnic identity changes from being not quite white, or non-white in some cases, to becoming full-fledged white people. And when those people did have choices and options, they did choose to leave Boyle Heights and go live in other places.
We think of white flight as simply all of a sudden people don't want to live next door to other people. The truth is that the government subsidized white flight, that it was financially more difficult to stay in some of these neighborhoods for whites who had other options.
These options were sharply limited thanks to a federally funded mortgage risk assessment program commonly referred to as redlining.
They give Boyle Heights the lowest possible ranking. Its listing is red principally because it is multiracial. So if you're a returning serviceman, Jewish, trying to start a family, it is likely to cost you more to purchase a house in Boyle Heights, even the same house, as the San Fernando Valley, because the San Fernando Valley, mostly white, is given the best rating. So actually, to get a new mortgage is cheaper out in this new area that's seen as homogeneous and not risky, as opposed to Boyle Heights, even if that's the community you grew up in.
I was eager to get out and on my way. Boyle Heights is fine, but when you got out of Boyle Heights was comparable to a Watts today. It was a denigrated, mixed immigrant working class neighborhood. Whether it actually was it or not, that was the reputation it had. And I felt the effects of that. The boyfriend's mother who says to my face, does he have to go all the way to Boyle Heights every night? Or the counselor who says, well, I don't think that you would do well in that particular school. Or even the boss who's wary about having a Boyle Heights girl at his cash register.
This was the real symbolic of change because you could better yourself.
One of the reasons that the Jewish community leaves is for the first time other neighborhoods open up to them. And many of the biggest developers are themselves Jewish. So they're advertising in all the Jewish newspapers that these are not just open to Jews, these are being built by Jews for Jews.
Izzy Cohen left his happy home and took a trip to Honolulu town. When he got off the boat, he took a look around. He had heard of the hula girls that you read about every day. He saw one and he wrote a letter to his wife. I heard him say, Becky, Becky, I ain't coming back no more. Tell the tailor shop, hang a sign upon the door.
Oh, I remember it well. It was 1945 when they started building it, when they completed the freeway. They moved out practically the entire Russian community. It was that whole area right there was Russian homes. And that affected us. I would have loved if everything had stayed the same. There was like a Russian church and a Russian market on every other corner. And I even could speak a little Russian in my youth, you know, the babunya and jabishka and all that good stuff.
Pomona 60 freeway, where you can transfer either to the Golden State Freeway or to the Santa Monica Freeway. This 5 freeway behind me connects to the Golden State like a mile up north. It's about 135 acres.
Before and after World War II, California highway officials created a master plan for building freeways throughout Southern California. While wealthier neighborhoods had the political and financial power to forestall or minimize proposed freeway developments in their areas, Boyle Heights would be hit with an unparalleled, over 100% built. Although presented as a connecting thread for California, for a low-income, underrepresented neighborhood like Boyle Heights, the interstate highway system would create a devastating fault line, fracturing the community.
The hardest part of being a highway engineer is explaining to people why we have to take their land for a new highway.
It has been deliberate in the sense of where freeways should go and which places can be expendable.
We did not want to move, and so we were the last ones to move out.
If you lived in this house and you had a neighbor, well, that neighbor was no longer there. And matter of fact, your street turned into a cul-de-sac.
These new highways will have a far-reaching economic impact on the entire nation. They are a shot in the arm for cities that have begun to feel the impact of growing downtown traffic congestion. They open up vast new areas for suburban living.
So Boyle Heights really has become the victim in many ways of so-called American progress and the American dream itself. If we think of the American dream as the house with a picket fence in the suburbs with a car.
You know, you don't realize when you're growing up here, you're walking around here, you're driving around here, how many underpasses you go on these freeways just to get to another part of the neighborhood.
In some ways, to understand the freeways in Boyle Heights, you really need to take everything that you know about freeways and somehow flush it down the toilet.
Despite substantial community efforts to save the neighborhood, freeway construction flourished in Boyle Heights for more than 2 decades as California planners made their dream of a complete interstate highway system a reality. 15,000 residents were displaced and 2,000 dwellings destroyed as the neighborhood became increasingly dissected. From the opening of the Santa Ana 5 freeway in 1944 to the widening of the Santa Monica 10 freeway in 1972.
So the centerpiece of that whole system was the East Los Angeles Interchange.
There's the 60 freeway, which is on the south side. The 101 that starts and stops there at Mission. The 5 and the 10 that crisscross.
Some of the contractors used to joke about it, that it was so complex that they nicknamed it the Spaghetti Bowl. It's a monster, it's an enormous system. So current residents who live in Boyle Heights actually have to deal with the largest freeway system in North America. And it doesn't take a scientist to figure out that that's probably not too good for your health.
So this is 2nd Street School, located right off the State and 2nd Street, right here in Boyle Heights, and its proximity is literally the backyard of the East LA Interchange. Nose bleeding and coughing up, stuff was kind of an everyday occurrence.
This highway means your children will be able to lead better lives in towns and cities that have had a chance to expand and to grow.
Boyle Heights paid the highest price for that growth in terms of having freeways come to Los Angeles and destroy parks, homes, churches.
Once the city signed the freeway agreement, it was essentially a done deal. Our residents have no more recourse. It takes more than a freeway to break the spirit of a community. Even if it's 1 freeway or 6 freeways, I mean, the spirit in Boyle Heights just cannot be broken by California planners.
There were artists, there were professional people, there were working class people. It was a real neighborhood where I think activists could feel comfortable and safe.
The rise of the suburbs came hand in hand with the rise of conformity and fear in the era of Senator McCarthy, prompting Jewish activists and other politically minded Americans to seek refuge in the democratic sanctuary of Boyle Heights.
McCarthyism starts to take hold in all these suburbs around Los Angeles, including some of the places that former Boyle Heights residents moved into. And as the rest of Southern California becomes very much taken with anti-communism, with a kind of conformity, a suburban conformity, Boyle Heights becomes seen as almost a bunker against McCarthyism.
Boyle Heights was a more radical neighborhood. There was the Communist Party there were the anarchists, there were the socialists. So there's this whole mixture of political beings.
I remember even as a child of 5 years old, when my mother went to meetings, we had phone calls from the FBI where I didn't know anything else, and I was instructed not to say that my mother was at a meeting, because I did. And I was always telling my mother everything that happened, so she said, no, you don't say anything.
This was a community where people didn't have to be afraid politically about their neighbors. It's working class, it's multiracial, and it's where leftists are.
But we were limited. We could only go so far. Were we truly represented in the city council in Los Angeles? I'm sure we weren't treated as well.
Boyle Heights, for the most part, was a pretty neglected community. And the city council person that represented that area was basically a representative in name only. And it was a coalition of Japanese Americans, Jewish Americans, and Latinos who came together and basically said, enough is enough.
My mother was a social activist, and she'd go door to door talking about issues, social issues. She worked for Roy Ball.
The first Mexican American to be elected to the Los Angeles City Council in the 20th century, Edward Roy Ball's campaign was led by the newly formed Community Service Organization.
The CSO is interesting in that it is heavily Mexican, but it gets a lot of support from Jews and others in Boyle Heights. So it was multiracial, actually, from the very start, even though it was multiracial in order to elect a Mexican American to a district that was becoming more and more Mexican American. What's interesting is that Jews and actually other white ethnics didn't find this at all strange to very actively try to be empowering racial populations. They thought that was essentially what had led to their growth, their movement out of ghettos. So it was perfectly normal in their mind at that time to be supporting these efforts.
Whole groups of men and women went door to door in their neighborhoods to register voters, which had really never been done before. And because of that increase in voter registration, most people argue that that led to Edward Boyle's election.
The impact on Boyle Heights was, first of all, streets started getting paved. Stop signs were put up in different areas. And they had an advocate in the Los Angeles City Council. It was a very difficult time because as the first Latino, many of the battles that he fought on behalf of the Boyle Heights community were very lonely battles, when there was rampant discrimination, open discrimination. And it was made very, very clear that we were not welcome in a lot of places where traditionally any minority, Latino, African American, was only welcome through the back door because they were, there to work. And so my father set a very high bar for himself to make sure that he was ethical and that he always kept the community that he represented in mind.
His election to the city council really became one of the first times where you had Mexican Americans being represented in city government. Prior to that, you really had nothing.
It was an uneasy time. You could feel a lot of tension, not only at Roosevelt among staff and students, but as time went on, you could feel it between student and student. So it was something. It was something that I think politically enlightened the community, but I think it also caused different groups who were ethnically diverse to kind of step back from each other, and to all of a sudden we saw each other as different groups, and that made it a little difficult.
The 1960s affected Boyle Heights in a number of different ways. One of the things that is very clear is that though Mexican Americans were dominating the Boyle Heights population, this is the one period of time where Boyle Heights had more African Americans than any other point. Partly because of public housing growing so importantly in Boyle Heights in 3 different areas. Partly also because while for the most part in Los Angeles, Mexican Americans and African Americans were more separated from each other, Boyle Heights was one of the places where they actually came together.
Boyle Heights gave me a sense of family because my family was from here when the projects were first started. So we're probably one of the first families from the projects.
If you see, for example, Roosevelt High School in the 60s, you get, yes, a significant number of Mexican Americans. You still have some Japanese Americans, but you increasingly have more African Americans there. All of the themes then of the 60s, the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, the Chicano movement, are kind of going through Roosevelt High School in different waves. And there's a lot more interaction between African Americans and Mexican Americans, both positive and negative.
You know, when you talk about the civil rights movement, people tend to think it's only about black folk. It may have started in the South and it was about black folk, but when it moved west, it was about more than just black folk. It was about civil rights. It was about human rights.
Especially in Boyle Heights, one of the main events was the 1968 high school blowouts or walkouts. It really brought attention to the issues that Mexican Americans were facing in Los Angeles, especially with education.
Frustrated by what they defined as in-class segregation, students at Roosevelt and 4 other East Side high schools brought their grievances to the school board. They sought greater representation in honors classes, access to college prep courses, more Mexican American teachers, the development of Mexican American history and culture curriculums, and a lifting of the ban prohibiting Spanish from being spoken on school grounds.
There was so much prejudice in the schools that the students were like, okay, maybe we were going to get some changes made. And so they were bringing a focus of the problems in high school to say, this isn't right. We're not getting the same education as Hamilton High or Hollywood High. You know, it was not the same. The money spent in the East Los Angeles schools was not the same.
When their formal petition failed, the students staged a unified walkout, bringing the issues of equality in education to the public eye.
But it was a scary time. You know, the sheriffs and police were not messing around. They were not our friend.
When you look at the footage from that particular event, you see the emergence or the manifestation of this kind of new militancy, a new identity. You see, you know, people carrying signs that say Chicanos or Brown Power, which is really new at that particular point, especially for high school students.
Roosevelt really saw itself as pushing for student rights, trying to better the educational system at Roosevelt. And it caused a lot of controversy as the movement got stronger in the walkouts, and it evolved into a Chicano movement.
Many times, even though there were connections and collaborations and coalitions, I think there was still a feeling among many Mexican Americans or Chicanos at that period that their issues weren't necessarily being recognized, being seen still as sort of this immigrant new population, and that doesn't take into account the generations and generations that have laid those roots, right, prior to these people who are coming in now at this point in time.
Growing up here, it wasn't all just beautiful. I mean, we were dealing with a lot of issues, a lot of harassment from the police, and all of us were tagged with being undocumented and being aliens, and that was really hitting home to me because I grew up thinking my mom was going to be gone and my dad was going to be gone. My dad was in the construction industry and they were having raids all the time from immigration, so we never knew if my dad was going to come back. But we wanted to make a difference. We wanted to have a better life. Our parents were working hard, and some of the kids in the neighborhood were at my house because both of their parents were working. And I think we just had something instilled in us by looking at them that they were worn out by the end of the day. They had 2 jobs sometimes, and they were hoping that we wouldn't have to go through the same thing that they did. And education was the way out.
When I was at Roosevelt in the 70s and 80s, there was much more of an awareness, a social movement here, that things have got to be different. The way I taught the Boyle Heights class is that this was a academic, college-bound class. We're going to learn about Boyle Heights, East LA, Los Angeles County, California, the United States, and the world. So that was my perspective. If you don't do that, you create boosterism history, how wonderful Boyle Heights is, everything's so great here. And you know, Boyle Heights is 6 square miles, and you put a wall around it, and everything else doesn't matter, but it does matter. It's no different than today. We have to break the stereotypes down and really understand this community objectively. I think if you know your identity, where you're from, you clearly have a voice different than if you don't know where you're from.
All the work that I've done and all the issues I've been working on have come back and affected my neighborhood, from the education issues and all the election work and the campaigns. And it's important for, I think everyone in the neighborhood to be vigilant of all the issues that apparently still haven't gone away.
Growing up in Boyle Heights, I had a very chola accent, and it took an acting coach to make me get rid of it.
When I moved away and I was working and I told someone that I was from Boyle Heights, the East LA area, I always used to get the reaction of horror, actually.
That's one of the things I would change about Boyle Heights, just the way people view it, just the way people have handled it in the past, and hopefully don't continue to handle it the same way in the future.
Barrio means neighborhood, and it is for this, the reputation of the neighborhood, that they are ready to kill and willing to die. Who is fighting who? Americans of Mexican heritage are fighting each other, and embarrassed community leaders have been unable to stop it. What's more, it is spreading in California and the Southwest. Warring gangs like the ones we found in East Los Angeles.
Boyle Heights received national news coverage in 1978 when 60 Minutes produced an in-depth report on Mexican-American gangs in East Los Angeles, an aspect of the community that would dominate public perception for decades.
For some people, Boyle Heights is it's really the gang mecca. It's like the drive-by capital, We have so many gallery openings, we have so many plays and shows and events that if the media covered everything we did here, we could upstage all the shootings and bad things that happen in Boyle Heights. So that's an issue.
Gunfire, intimidation, murder, and fear. That's the reality of life in any number of gang-ravaged neighborhoods right here in America.
There was a special on CNN about 2 years ago about how Boyle Heights was the gang capital of Los Angeles.
We want to warn you, our report includes some graphic images that may not be suitable for young viewers. But this is reality. This is Gangs of Hollenbeck. For 15 square miles east of downtown Los Angeles, there's Hollenbeck. Just about every block here claimed by a gang.
A lot of people here really said, hey, that's not the life. That's not what we're living now. Yes, gangs exploded here in the 70s and 80s, but it's tapered off. It's not what we would like the rest of the country to know Boyle Heights as.
I first came to Boyle Heights right after I was ordained a priest in 1984, but then I was assigned as pastor of Dolores Mission Church in 1986. So my parish were the public housing projects of Pico Gardens and Aliso Village. When I arrived, we had 8 gangs at war with each other in the 2 housing projects. And I buried my first young person killed because of this sadness in 1988. And when they write the book about violence in LA and gang violence, that's the decade of death, 88, 98. So that kind of set me and my parish off on a whole path to try to address this. There was no decision to start anything in Boyle Heights. It was born there in a community from below. So nobody airlifted it in, and it wasn't my idea. It was just sort of organically grown from the people there. It's still a very stressed community, though I don't know how it compares to other communities as it did in the days that I was pastor there. It was absolutely the poorest section of Los Angeles was my parish. But that's evolved. And Boyle Heights is sort of gentrified, you know? So it's a kind of a different thing. It's funny that our second office was right next door to the Mitla Cafe, which was quite the watering hole in those days, you know? And now it's called M, you know, with kind of almost like a rope line and a bouncer to let people in, you know. Well, nothing could be further from what it was.
Boyle Heights, como toda la ciudad de Los Ángeles, como todos Los Ángeles lo quieren transformar. A Los Ángeles los quieren transformar de norte a sur, de oeste a oeste. Quieren hacer otra ciudad nueva, como el estilo Nueva York. Y eso quieren hacer con Boyle Heights.
Al Comité de la Esperanza, pues nos dedicamos a ayudar. Es una corporación non-profit. La gente que necesita asesoría legal, le ayudamos, les damos consejos para que no sean desalojados y pues luchamos por toda la comunidad.
Yo lo quisiera así como está. Me siento en mi país así como está.
There's a sort of this resurgence of trying to build Boyle Heights, and some people see it as gentrification, and other people want to sort of maintain the essence, I suppose, of Boyle Heights. Organizations like the Mothers of East Los Angeles or the International Institute providing services to immigrants for generations and generations, and new organizations that I think are fascinating, like Libros Schmibros, like the Corazón del Pueblo, or, you know, like the theater, the Casa 0101, that are really trying to harness the kind of history that Boyle Heights has and also harness the community that's there now and not leave it as some forgotten vestige of Los Angeles history, you know, that in a bygone time, this was a great place.
Some of the organizations that I'm involved here in Boyle Heights would include Mothers of East LA, Boyle Heights Neighborhood Council, Coalition for a Safe and Drug-Free Community in Boyle Heights, very active at my children's school, which is Malabar Street School, very active with the councilman's office, assistant manager over at the farmer's market. I'm also part of the development for ridership on the Metro Rail. It's kind of neat to think that within our own realm, that I would say I do have a name, and I would say it would be Boyle Heights. They're my community.
Typically, when people talk about gentrification, it's kind of, okay, the white people are moving in and displacing the people of color, which are usually poor Black and brown people, right? This kind of gentrification, I think, is a little bit different because just based really on skin color and racial ethnic identity, these are mostly Latino people that are leading the wave of gentrification.
We've been fighting for the last 2 years just to bring a 7-Eleven into Boyle Heights. And that's kind of sad when you think about, really, a 7-Eleven? But corporate doesn't want to move in here.
Although many people seek to better Boyle Heights, the debate over what constitutes beneficial development divides the community. Controversial projects such as the Metro Gold Line expansion create tremendous tension. Some view the addition of light rail as essential to revitalizing the neighborhood. Others see it as a disquieting reminder of the destruction wrought by the freeways. These conflicts reveal residents' hopes and fears of what may become of Boyle Heights.
We do want to make our community better. We do want to make our community great. We want to remove ourselves from the negative stereotypes of our community of gangs and violence. And how do we make that? How do we create that? And I think definitely is community effort and creating community, not by big name stores, you know. That for me does not create a safety in my community. It doesn't bring me safety.
And so there's a real tension at work, or at least a question about what the future is going to hold for working class families in Boyle Heights, for the possibility of another transition. There is this interesting dilemma about whether multiracialism will actually work in favor of gentrification and move out a lot of the working class Latinos who now call Boyle Heights home. It's not an easy issue, but it's also not clear what will happen. You have people like Oscar de la Hoya investing in property development in Boyle Heights. So all the issues related to the mortgage meltdown, all these are huge for a community like Boyle Heights. Can you sustain working class homes in a city like Los Angeles? Can you have a neighborhood in which people aren't simply renters but feel invested in terms of home ownership? That all is going to depend on having fair and equitable mortgages, creating an environment in which people can sustain a neighborhood and own property.
My whole life, right? This is my life, Boyle Heights. And a lot of times people dream of, moving out to Montebello. Like, I can't wait to move to Montebello. I can't wait. Imagine having a house in Whittier. Wow, we made it. So those are our dreams that we had growing up, right? And a lot of times people, they leave the ghetto, or I don't really like to call it a ghetto because they leave your little family, your extended family, and they never think about coming back once they left, right? Because you spend your whole life trying to get out. And I got out. I got out, moved everybody from my family out. But getting out ain't enough. I feel like there's a hole to where I gotta come back.
You can't really romanticize a place unless you have some distance to it. When you are poor and living in the barrio, there's a lot less people there that will view it as a highly desirable place, which is not to say a lot of people don't like living in Boyle Heights, because they do, and it has a lot to offer. But I think over the years it's also changed, and there's another dynamic going on there of people seeing it as, oh yes, this is like one of the cradles of Mexican-American culture, if you will, in the United States, and it is.
The Boyle Heights that people know or that I knew growing up was, it's almost like as soon as you cross the river, you cross the border.
LA is considered to be what we call a hyper-segregated city because of its intense levels of segregation. It's very segregated by income, and it's segregated by race.
One of the particular concerns today is increasing class divide in the United States. The 1%, the 99% is very much part of that discourse. So when we think about our racial futures and the futures of neighborhoods, we need to think in terms of race and class, because these class divides and these racial divides get written and reinforced over one another.
In some way, it is really blame the Mexicans, and let's get them all out, and then everything will be fine. But Mexican Americans are being made all the time, right? Because you have immigrants coming in, they're having children. Those children are having to define themselves as Mexican background or Central American background, but living in the United States. And they are going through kind of the same things that people in the 1960s were going through, medical services, education, political representation, or lack thereof.
How are immigrants treated? What are their rights? What are their rights as workers? What are their rights as people who may not speak English? What are their rights as undocumented persons?
I think here in Boyle Heights, we're battling something very different. And it's unique because it's an immigrant community that became another immigrant community, for something multicultural, to being now predominantly Mexican, to what's next.
That's the reason why Lorraine Jobs is important with College Track in Boyle Heights. I said, can we bring College Track to my neighborhood? Why? Because it's important. Because there's these companies are spending lots and lots of money investing in the future. Government is not spending lots and lots of money investing in the future of education. Right? There's pencils and chalkboards in these classrooms. What?
We never took the time to ask who are the developers anyway. And if we knew who the developers were, we would ask them, why is this community underdeveloped? Well, guess what? We're the developers.
One of the things that I've learned since I've been in Congress is just how unique Boyle Heights is and how unique my experience is in terms of growing up in Boyle Heights, because there are members of Congress who have never had a friendship with an African American or a Japanese American or a Chinese American. It's unbelievable. So there's this big gap. And when you don't have that basic understanding about people of diverse backgrounds, then you end up making very bad policy, and you end up buying into the demonization and the fear of something that is different.
Boyle Heights stands for what we could become if we stood against forgetting that we belong to each other.
We as human beings are social animals. We're not meant to be by ourselves somewhere, but in some ways that's become the trajectory. We're all kind of looking for different mountains to become alone, or a seaside cottage in which we're the only person living in a big house with many cars. And of course, seniors will tell us, no, that's not what's going to make you happy. As an 80-year-old or as a 90-year-old looking back on their life, it's not the money they made, it's not the possessions they had. It's those relationships with your children, those relationships with your neighbors, those meaningful events in life. So in some ways, ironically, the future of we the people in this country is to rediscover that social dimension of ourselves. So Boyle Heights, even though it's been so demeaned and thought to be so lowly, actually embodies that kind of human sociality that is at the core of who we are.
So they don't sell kishka. And they don't sell pickles, and we don't have the Cantor's delicatessen, but there's something else in place. And as you drive through much of the neighborhood, it's not bad, folks. It's an interesting place to be.
There's a lot of money coming into Boyle Heights. It's like it ain't called the gold line for no reason. There's gold in Boyle Heights. Our architecture, our history, there's a lot of beauty. And if we invest in that beauty, then we invest in our community, as opposed to investing in things that, might destroy what Boyle Heights has always been.